All right. How's it going, everybody? I'm Noah, and I did my World Bank presentation on the crime and inequality rates in St. Lucia. Next slide, please. So here I have my data table, and St. Lucia, if you see, the rural populations are an 81%. So those are people living with very, very low living standards because St. Lucia does not have that great of living conditions. And most of them are farmers or they work like small tourist areas. They don't really have any factories when I was looking into that. And that's why the Gini index, which is basically putting it simply, how much percentage of the wealth 2% owns. So 51% of the wealth is owned by a lot of people and everyone else is pretty much dirt poor. And that correlates to the excuse me, the crime rate. So next slide, please. So here's my correlation between the Gini index and the crime rate. So as you can see, as the crime increases, so does the Gini index. They have a direct correlation. And then this is really concerning because they have a population of just under 200,000. And if you look at the homicide rate between 2012 and 2021, it had a very big spike back in 2017, and then it lowered, and then it went right back up, just like the Gini index did. So it flattened out for a bit. People started making a bit more money, but then it started going up, and that caused the inequality to grow even more. So people are committing crimes just to like meet their basic needs for survival. Next slide, please. So around 30% is the current crime rate in St. Lucia. That's compared to the current population, around 54,900 people are convicts and or having commit or have been committing crimes on the island. And that's really concerning when you have a population of 183,000. That would definitely make me like always be looking behind my back, see like I'm being followed. And according to like Insight Crime, they had 25 killings within the first 5 months of this year, and then had a record high of 74 last year. And this statistic will continue to rise because there's not much investment put into St. Lucia's industrial sides. Almost all of their income and GDP growth comes from like 6 months out of the year when farming and tourism is really, really high. So in between that, most people are just like saving what they had made in those 6 months and then trying to get by. And that's why the crime is just continuing to skyrocket because things are getting more expensive because of inflation. And doing my research, I thought like a big company like Amazon, Nike, if they were to put a warehouse or factory on the island that could be used for all year round productions and give people a lot of jobs, that wouldn't solve the inequality rate completely because it's already so vast. However, it would give the people in the lowest percentiles a means to keep working and a way to help make their ends meet until those 6 months of high tourism and farming come by. And then more people wouldn't have to rely to committing crime, stealing, or just robbing people to meet their basic needs. Next slide, please. So here's my works cited. And thank you. That was my presentation on St. Lucia.
All right, I'm Brennan Zweiback. For the World Bank project, I chose the country of Japan. Using some key indicators off the World Bank website, collected some pertinent indicators that reflect the social and economic trends of Japan. Some valuable statistics to focus on are the relatively low Gini index, relatively low to comparable first world countries like the United States. Their Gini index sits at 32.9%, while countries like the US hover around 41. So this means that the wealth is more equally distributed throughout the country. To quickly explain the Gini index, 0 means that there is perfect equality with wealth disbursement, and 100 means perfect inequality. Another thing to focus on is extremely low rural population rate, which is just 8%, which is actually one of the lowest in the world. That will be an important part of my slide later. Another thing to focus on is Japan has bounced back from the COVID-19 pandemic economically as far as GDP, where they hit 0.4% negative growth during that time period. And now they're back up to about 0.2. which is a normal rate. Also, another thing is that to focus on is that Japan has a pretty low poverty rate, which is comparable to other first world countries, and 100% of the population does have access to electricity. So looking at some notable statistical trends, the rural population decline, as noted before, is 8%, and 34.2 million people lived in that rural population in Japan in 1960, and now in 2021 it sits at 10.2 million, so a large decrease. This mass exodus started well over 60 years ago. However, in the year 2000 to 2010, we've seen 16 million people move out of those rural areas and into the more urban areas in Japan. Another trend is their GDP growth, which has been consistently around 0.8, while the rest of the world sits at around 3.5 to 4.5%. So their GDP has been growing relatively slowly. And like I said, in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, they saw a 4.5% decrease in their GDP, which was the second largest shrink outside of the 2008 recession in the last 60 years. Historically, after post-World War II for Japan, they saw a massive GDP growth because that was a large growth period in Japan's history after they had been desecrated by the war. But since then, they have been shrinking since the 1960s. Another thing is their overall population decline has been a relative crisis for Japan over the last 60 years. They've had a shrinking population for the last 60 years, but since 2008, they've actually had a higher death rate than birth rate. And last year was their largest year as far as population decline, as 0.5% of the population was the total amount that shrank. And in 2008, there were 128.1 million people, and in 2021, today, we see just 125.8 million people that live in Japan. Lastly, this creates a correlation between the population and the overall economy. The simple equation, less people equates to a smaller economy, which of course results in less money in the system and less assets. So their population crisis, as mentioned before, has been on the constant decline since 1971. Their death rates have outpaced their birth rates for 13 consecutive years now. And their population last year decreased a high of 640,000 people. A lot of this had to do to COVID-19 policy that did not allow really any immigration in Japan, paired with their already low birth rates. And the outlook for Japan doesn't look very good as far as population growth. By 2055, the working age population will have shrunk by 30 million people. And their total population could estimate to be around 100 million people by 2049, which would be almost a loss of 100 million people in the last 80 years. And currently 30% of the population is above 65 years old, so they have a high aging population as well. This, of course, equates to the economy because the decrease in working age population means less people can work in the economy. That rural population, like I said, will fall at around 17% in the next 12 years. And it's already at 8%. So that will be a very small population that isn't living in urban Japan. There's 115 million people currently that live on just 14% of the landmass in those urban areas. And because of this, the rural public services such as schools, hospitals, and police stations, emergency personnel, etc., have been very short-handed, with emergency response times being well over 30 minutes in those areas. And finally, this results into people just simply moving out of Japan or moving out of the rural area agricultural business, which has resulted in 20% of assets leaving the Japanese borders, actually. And so, of course, this will equate to a smaller economy for the country. Here's my works cited, and thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm JC, and I studied the inequality in Yemen. So the stats I decided to focus on were the poverty head count, the rural population, and the amount of crop production. So the poverty head count is pretty big and is about a fifth of the population, and over half lives in a rural area. And despite the large rural population, it didn't have as much crop production as I thought. It is slightly higher than average on this chart, but definitely not super impressive. And for this slide, I compared the GDP growth of Yemen to our own country, the US. And even though the United States crop production is pretty similar to Yemen's, the two countries have very different GDP, with Yemen's is actually decreasing. Also, our rural population is much smaller here. So I just assumed that Yemen would have more economic growth due to their crop production. But despite all that, their GDP has been on a decline. And I also did some research on the history of the country, which used to be two countries, North Yemen and South Yemen, which became one country in 1990. But just a few years later, a civil war started because of economic and political turmoil. And in 1995, the country did start an economic reform program, which was supported by the IMF as well as the World Bank. However, due to their history and kind of the rocky start of the country, it seems that they haven't been able to reach economic stability, and inequality continues.
All right. So for mine, I'm Alex Skimmerich, and I did correlation between crime rate and inequality in Sweden. Next slide. So for this, the important indicators that we went over, obviously GNI over PPP provides some useful information showing that Sweden is a pretty average economy to use to compare. But what isn't average about it is its incredibly low poverty headcount being one of the lowest that we have on this chart. Its GNI index being the lowest, essentially, as well as it has the highest income by lowest 20%, giving it a really equal economy in which we can compare to others. So here we just kind of go over what GNI is, but we've already done that, so I won't bore you guys with that. Next slide. So first we have the GNI of Sweden. Currently it's at 28.4. And then the next is the GNI of the US, which is far higher at 41.5, as you can see on this chart over here. And then the last one, which we can compare, is Peru. And while its GNI has been decreasing over the past several years, it provides a good benchmark for what can be considered a very unequal country. So crime, don't do that, but next part, we're gonna look at first the Swedish crime statistics. So crimes per 100,000, it doesn't tend to change much. It's stayed pretty constant, although it has gone up a bit as time goes on. And so Sweden currently has a crime rate of 48 per 100,000, which compared to a country like the US, which is at a rate of 47.8, it's actually pretty standard for most advanced economies. When we look at a country like Peru, which is 66.72, it shows that when poverty and inequality is extreme, you will see a large impact from that. But for a standard economy, crime rate tends to hover around the same area. Obviously, this differs for different countries, but it demonstrates how these factors can play off each other. Next slide. So just a bit more about Sweden and its relationship with the IMF. This information comes from Riksbank, which is the Swedish national bank. So one, they're members of the executive board of the IMF. The next piece of information, they control 0.93% of the votes. But to counter that, they're also part of the Nordic Baltic constituency, which has 3.2% of the votes, giving them much stronger control over the policies that are implemented there. The last thing is that Sweden has had no transactions with the IMF since January 1st, 1984, which basically just says that for as long as they have transactions recorded, they haven't needed anything from the IMF. So they're doing pretty stable. And then just we're excited. Thank you.